Once again, thank you for joining us for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum's latest edition of Curator's Corner. Today we will have our archivist speaking on Akira Toki and the Purple Heart Battalion. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, if everybody can submit their questions via chat, that would be fantastic. We will bring those up on the screen for the presenter after the presentation is over with. But before we get started, I would just like to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all this free programming that we get to do to include our Curator's Conversations today. But not only that, also for our movie nights and our trivia nights and all the other fantastic programming that we do get to offer to everybody out there on these virtual platforms. So thank you again to the Wisconsin Veterans Museums Foundation for their support, and in particular, their executive director, Ms. Jennifer Carlson. Today, we are welcoming Mr. Russell Horton, who's going to be speaking about Akira Toki and the Purple Heart Battalion. Once again, last time I'll mention this, if we can submit our questions via chat, I will bring those questions up at the end of the presentation for Russ. Without any further ado, Russ, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and let everybody get into this presentation.
All right, thanks, Eric. Just want to check and make sure I'm coming through okay.
You sound great to me.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. You know, working at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum is such a unique job, and it's an incredibly interesting place to work. By being able to interact with the letters, the photographs, and the objects of Wisconsin veterans from the Civil War to the present, to be able to learn their stories and to feel like I know people I've never met, some of whom died before I was even born. It's a very special thing. I did have the privilege of meeting Akira Toki early in my career. If I had not already known his story, I would have had no idea about some of the things he experienced and accomplished just by meeting him. He was soft-spoken, he was humble, he had a great sense of humor, and he had that no big deal, I just did what I had to do kind of attitude that so many men and women who served in World War II have. But I think Akira Toki's story is a big deal, and he did do much more than he had to do. The story of what Toki and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team accomplished reflects what makes our country special. But the story of what he and more than 100,000 Japanese Americans had to endure through no fault of their own is one that we as Americans maybe prefer not to think about, one that we would like to think wouldn't happen in our country. I think it is important to look at both sides of that so that we can fully understand what Akira Toki and other Japanese Americans went through during World War II and how overcoming it all makes their accomplishments all the more spectacular. So in recognition of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, it is my honor to share with you today the story of Akira Toki and the Purple Heart Battalion. It's impossible to talk about the experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II without talking about internment. 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor in February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order that authorized the War Department to evacuate all persons deemed a threat from the West Coast to internment camps located further inland. Because of the panic induced by the attack on Pearl Harbor, all people of Japanese descent, including those born in the United States, came under suspicion. On March 29, 1942, Public Proclamation Number 4 began the forced evacuation and detention of West Coast residents of Japanese ancestry. These men, women, and children were often given only 48 hours to dispose of or make arrangements to care for their property, and many homes, farms, businesses, and private belongings were lost forever. Between March and August 1942, over 110,000 people, 70,000 of whom were United States citizens, were sent to assembly centers where they were tagged to indicate which relocation center they were to be sent to. Relocation centers were located further inland, often in remote areas in California, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. At the internment camps, 4 to 5 families shared an Army-style barracks, usually with no walls or hope of privacy from one another. Most internees spent 3 years or more in these camps. As the war ended and the camps were slowly evacuated, many returned home to find that they had lost everything and had to start anew. Others chose to make a fresh start somewhere else. And there is a strong Wisconsin connection to Japanese-American internment. Fort McCoy, which in the 1940s was called Camp McCoy, served as a mobilization site for tens of thousands of American troops during World War II. I'll talk more about some of those troops who trained there in just a little bit, but it also served as a detention center for over 6,000 German, Korean, and Japanese prisoners of war, as well as almost 300 enemy alien internees. Of those 300 internees, almost 2/3 were Japanese Americans. So while it was not nearly as big as those out west, Camp McCoy did indeed serve as a Japanese internment camp during World War II. This is a picture of the barracks that the Japanese internees lived in while at Camp McCoy. Now, some sources that I found stated that the first 170 Japanese Americans to be detained in the United States were sent to Camp McCoy, but I have not been able to 100% confirm that yet. So it was in this environment, with all of this going on, that Akira Toki and more than 20,000 Japanese American men and women served in the US military during World War II. These brave Americans sought to prove their loyalty by joining in the fight, and their record of service is incredible. While not as well known as some other ethnic groups of service people in World War II, like the Navajo Code Talkers or the Tuskegee Airmen, their story deserves to be told. So today I want to give a broad overview of the service of Japanese Americans in World War II, particularly those who served in the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And to make it a little more personal, I'm going to focus whenever possible on Akira Toki. He has a remarkable story that is kept alive at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum through the papers and photographs he donated, as well as the oral history interviews he did. And you'll be seeing some of those papers and photographs in this presentation, and technology permitting, you will be able to hear him describe his experiences in his own words through clips from his oral history interview. Akira Richard Toki was born on January 17, 1916 in Madison, Wisconsin. His parents, who can be seen here in this newspaper photograph, were both immigrants from Japan. They operated a farm on the outskirts of the city, and they raised 3 daughters and their only son, Akira. He grew up helping out on the farm and attended local schools, graduating from Madison West High School in 1936. He was drafted into the U.S. Army on February 12, 1942. According to Toki, his family was accepted in the Madison community and did not face much of the fear and discrimination experienced by Japanese Americans on the West Coast. One of the audio clips a little later in this presentation will allow you to hear him talk about this a little. On a side note, interestingly, on the exact same day Toki was drafted, another Madison resident of Asian descent was drafted. Shukwing Jo, a college student who was born in China but had become an American citizen, was inducted along with Toki. Given the extreme animosity between China and Japan at the time, the local media played up on the fact that a Japanese American and a Chinese American would be fighting in the same army. Shukwing Jo was born in Canton, China, and came to Madison, Wisconsin with his family as a young child. He was attending the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a music major when he was drafted into the Army Air Force. He served as an administrative specialist with the 455th Air Service Group. He deployed to Europe in October 1943 and returned home in August of 1945. After being discharged, he owned a restaurant in Madison for a few years before taking a job with the state government. He also served in the Wisconsin Air National Guard for 20 years. He was a charter member of a VFW post in Madison and a proud veteran. He married and had 4 children and 2 grandchildren before he passed away in 2003. The local press in Madison played up the multicultural aspect of the U.S. military, with this story highlighting mothers of different ethnicities. In case you have any trouble reading the slide, the 4 ethnicities represented are Italian American, Irish American, African American, and Japanese American. So you can see that it was a big deal around Madison when Akira Toki joined the Army. Now, around the same time that Akira Toki was getting so much attention around Madison, thousands of Japanese Americans in Hawaii were also getting a lot of attention, though not always quite so positive. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, public sentiment turned strongly against the Japanese, and this all too often included Japanese Americans. As the state of Hawaii began marshaling its military forces, state officials discovered that hundreds of their National Guardsmen were Japanese Americans. Most of them, like Akira Toki, were Nisei, meaning they were the children of immigrants, were born in the United States, and were United States citizens. However, the fear of spies was so great that there was a large movement to disarm them and discharge them from the military. Eventually, the Hawaiian soldiers of Japanese descent were gathered together and in June 1942 shipped to California, where they became the 100th Infantry Battalion. Almost entirely composed of Japanese American soldiers, though initially with white officers, the 100th Infantry Battalion was different from other Army units in a lot of ways. Most infantry battalions were numbered 1 through 3, so the designation of 100 marked these men as different. At the time of World War II, African Americans still served in segregated units with white officers, which resembled the 100th Infantry Battalion in many ways. However, not all Japanese Americans served in segregated units. Some, like, for example, Native American soldiers, were integrated into white units. So in terms of segregation in the military, Japanese Americans fell somewhere in between there during World War II. After organizing in California, the first stop of the 100th Infantry Battalion was Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. They were the first unit to train there since a major redevelopment and expansion at the start of the war. And one of their first duties at Camp McCoy was to guard the Japanese American detainees. The loyalty of these men was often tested, but they passed with flying colors. They even managed to impress and befriend local citizens, many of whom had probably never seen a Japanese American before in their lives. So I have the first audio clip here. As I mentioned, Akira Toki did an oral history interview with the museum in 1996, and because of that, we're able to hear him describe the events of his service in his own words. I'm going to play an excerpt now in which Toki briefly talked about the 100th Infantry Battalion being at Camp McCoy. Now, I'm going to do my best to make this come through as clearly as I can for you. I am cognizant of the fact that it might not come through the greatest, so I ask for your patience. I will try to summarize what he said after I play the clip, and keep in mind that we do preserve this oral history interview at our museum. So if you have an interest in hearing Akira Toki's oral history interview or interviews with over 2,000 other veterans, please feel free to contact us, and we can help you with that. So with that being said, here, hopefully, is Akira Toki.
Well, the 100th Battalion was a Japanese group there from Hawaii. They came to Camp McCoy. See, they were kind of in the same fix as I was. We were in Camp Grant. See?
Well, this is a much larger unit.
Yeah.
Hawaii is a large Japanese.
Yeah. It was a big group that came there. And then they were trained at Camp McCoy. I think they came in the fall. They stayed all winter till spring, I think. But they befriended a lot of people up around La Crosse area, and they showed them how true they were. So some of the officers used to come down to Madison. So they, talk to people here. Then they had the whole unit down here one time. They had a big parade for them around the square. So they befriended a lot of people in Madison. So they knew the 100th Battalion were very good. Because, see, my mother and sister went uptown to see the parade, and those guys spotted my mother and father. After the parade, they came over. They talked to my mother and sister, and they befriended them. So they used to come down to Madison quite frequently. So they used to come to our house. They kick their shoes off and sprawl all over the floor, relax. And they made themselves right at home. And my mother would cook them some Japanese food for them. Makeshift Japanese food, because we couldn't get all the ingredients.
Okay, hopefully that came through okay. But Akira Toki was talking about how the members of the 100th Infantry Battalion worked very hard to make friends and show their loyalty to both the residents around Camp McCoy, as well as residents in Madison. He also mentioned that his family invited members of the 100th Infantry Battalion to their home occasionally, and were able to offer them some food that maybe reminded them of their homes a little more. So again, hoping that came through okay. We've got a couple more audio clips throughout this presentation. But for now, moving on. So while the 100th Infantry Battalion was in Wisconsin, Toki himself was experiencing segregation similar to that, though on a smaller scale. He had been sent to Camp Robinson, Arkansas for basic training. Toki and a handful of other Japanese American soldiers were separated from the other trainees and isolated from regular activities. After the training period passed, the white soldiers moved on, but Toki and the other Nisei soldiers remained behind. Eventually, they were sent to Camp Grant in Illinois, where they joined other small groups of Japanese American soldiers and remained there for over a year. I'm going to try to play another audio clip here of Toki discussing this.
And then while we were at Camp Robinson, Arkansas, after the basic, they sent all the Caucasian guys to another camp, and we were left behind. The 6 here and 6 there, 6 there. We were all left behind. And I guess they didn't know what to do with us at that time. So I think at that time, Washington must have had an order out that they figured out we were unfit for combat duty. So they loads on a troop train from Camp Robinson, Arkansas, then they shipped us to Camp Grant in Illinois. Yeah. They didn't tell us where we were going because they had the blinds all pulled. Everything was hush-hush. So we didn't know where we were going, what we were going to do. We ended up in Camp Grant.
So Toki was talking about the fact that in his perception, the Army didn't seem to know what to do with the Japanese American soldiers in small numbers at Camp Robinson. They weren't wanting to send them on for combat training, but they didn't really know what else to do with them. So eventually they were sent up to Camp Grant, where they met up with other smaller groups of Japanese American soldiers. Interestingly, they did not end up far from Toki's home, since Camp Grant is located in Rockford, Illinois, which is not all that far from Madison. In the next audio clip that I have, and again, I'm hoping these are working okay, Toki tells a very interesting story about receiving a pass to go visit his family in Madison and some of the problems that he encountered while traveling there.
When I was at Camp Grant, a lot of those guys want to eat Japanese food, things like that. So I brought one of the boys. I don't know how he got his California car out to Camp Grant. I don't know, but I think he had some Caucasian friends that drove the car out for him. But anyway, he had a California licensed car at Camp Grant. So him and I and 3 others, 5 of us, said, I'll take you home. And we all got a pass to leave camp, and we took off. Then we driving up north towards Madison, then at Beloit. Somebody spotted us. So, 5 Orientals in the car with a uniform. They were real suspicious that we were spies or something.
In uniform.
Yeah, in uniform. That's right. So we got through Beloit. Beloit couldn't find us. Then we went through Janesville. They couldn't find us. Then they had a roadblock at Evansville. That's where we got caught. And police took us into their courthouse. They interrogated us. And then they wrote back to the company commander, asking if we were legit. And they saw our pass. The pass was legal. Everything cleared up. So they let us go. But the funny part of it, they stripped us everything. I even had a something like this in my pocket. They took the damn thing apart.
Did you get it back at least?
Yeah, I got it back.
Still.
Yeah.
So you got back up to Madison?
Yeah, I got back to Madison.
How would things, I'll pose this as sort of a 2-part question. How had Madison changed as a result of the war? And how did your own family situation change, if at all?
It changed some, but see, the people here in Madison are more broad-minded. And then see, we have a good American Legion post here. The commander was real good. He was really civic-minded person. So he backed my father and mother up. And then the mayor of the city was on my mother and father's side. And the FBI checked us through the whole neighborhood, asked us what we were, how we were. And they must have gave an awful good report because they didn't bother my father and mother at all.
So your family had very few problems.
Yeah, they didn't have. The only problem they had was they were restricted going out so far.
Right, 50 miles.
Yeah. But and even at the height of the war, they told my father to stay home. They will come out and pick up the vegetables and take it back to the store to sell. So they were, really helping my father and mother out that way. So, my sisters were in school at that time, and the teachers have everything under control.
So there was no California-like situation?
No, nothing like California situation at all.
Okay, so two parts to that quote. Toki described an experience when he was given a pass along with some other Japanese American soldiers to visit his family in Madison. They were pulled over by police and questioned pretty thoroughly until the officers at Camp Grant corroborated their story that they were legit. And then he also addressed how his family was treated in Madison by saying that, in particular, an American Legion post commander and the mayor of Madison kind of went out of their way to make sure that people knew that the Toki family was okay, and they did not experience some of the poor treatment that Japanese Americans in California perhaps received. So again, hoping those are coming through okay. So while Toki and other Japanese American soldiers awaited orders at Camp Grant, the 100th Infantry Battalion prepared to go overseas. They'd left Camp McCoy in early 1943 and received more training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. In August 1943, they shipped across the Atlantic to North Africa and soon joined in on the invasion of Italy. Over the next 9 months, they took part in major battles, including Monte Cassino, Anzio Beachhead, and the fall of Rome. During that time, the men of the battalion were awarded over 1,000 Purple Hearts, which earned them the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion. James Gillespie was the commander of the 100th Infantry Battalion during this time, and he returned to the U.S. on a furlough. After hearing what some people in the States had to say about his unit, he said that the men called themselves just plain Americans. He said, quote, "They've earned the right to call themselves anything they damn well please. I've never been so mad in my life as I have been since I returned to the United States and have heard cracks made about the Japanese fighting on our side in Italy. Anybody who calls these doughboys Jap is the most narrow-minded person I know of. These kids, so far as I'm concerned, are just as much American as I am." So back with Akira Toki, he remained segregated as he went south to receive intensive basic training in Camp Landing, Florida.
Then I went to Camp Landing, Florida. Had real basic training of 16 weeks. They gave us everything. They showed us how to drive everything, shoot enemy equipment. They gave us a real combat training.
Yeah. And now, is this with these other Japanese American boys? Or?
Yeah.
So you still remained all together?
We still remained all together. We were never mingled with Caucasians at all. We had Caucasian officers, but that's all.
Yeah.
And maybe one or two cadres, but we were all together. So from Camp Grant to Fort Sheridan to Camp Landing, Florida, we were all together. Then there was another group at McClellan in Georgia. There's another big group. But see, what they did was there were guys stationed at Fort Custer, the Jefferson Barracks, place like that. They're clusters of Orientals, just like there was at Camp Grant. So they rounded all of us up together and shipped us to Landing and in Florida.
Okay, so in that clip, Akira Toki was just reinforcing that the Japanese American soldiers were being kept segregated, that they had white officers, and that slowly these smaller groups were being brought together. So from Camp Landing, Toki went to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, to join the brand new 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was another predominantly Japanese American fighting unit. Two groups from the 442nd had already been sent over to Europe to augment the 100th Infantry Battalion, and Toki's group became the third, joining them in the summer of 1944. This is where the story of the 100th Infantry Battalion and Akira Toki's own story combine. In Italy, the 100th Infantry Battalion retained its designation due to its outstanding combat record, but it did become part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Toki was assigned to Company A, 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Toki and the 442nd moved from Italy to France, and in October 1944 engaged in the liberation of a French town called Bruillet. In 4 days of incredibly intense fighting, the regiment suffered 1,200 casualties. They were granted 5 days rest before being called into action again to rescue the lost battalion. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division, which was composed mostly of Texas National Guardsmen, had been isolated and surrounded by Germans for over a week. The 442nd, operating at only half strength due to their losses at Bruillet, was called upon to liberate them. It took them 5 days of vicious fighting to rescue the 230 survivors of the lost battalion. The 442nd suffered almost 4 times that number of casualties in the operation, with 200 dead and 600 wounded. This is another clip of Toki talking about why he thinks his unit took such high casualties.
We have to disprove that we were good citizens. And then that's why I think we lost so many guys and high casualty, because we were all gung-ho to prove that we were good citizens and good Americans. Right? So we and just like I said before, our battalion was a Purple Heart Battalion, but there's the whole regiment has over 9,000 Purple Hearters in that group. So,
Were you wounded?
yeah, I was wounded. Yeah,
How were you wounded?
I was wounded twice, but I only got one Purple Heart. I got hit in the head. That's why I'm crazy sometimes.
So I just saw one of the people smile on my picture, so you must be able to hear the audio at least a little bit. So yeah, in that clip, Toki talks about a theme that comes up in a lot of studies of the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion, and that is that they felt like they had to prove their loyalty on almost a constant basis. They were constantly fighting to prove that they were loyal and that they were Americans, and this led to them perhaps getting into situations that were dangerous and suffering these high casualty rates. He mentioned that between the two units, there were over 9,000 Purple Hearts issued, including one to him. And you got to hear Akira Toki's great sense of humor there right at the end when he said he was wounded in the head, and that's why he acts a little crazy sometimes. Okay, so decimated by the two battles at Bruillet and then rescuing the lost battalion. An example is that Company I of the 100th Battalion had 8 men reporting for duty out of 200 on the roster. The 442nd was relieved from the front lines and sent to guard the French-Italian border. Members of the unit refer to this as the Champagne Campaign, and they spent the winter of 1944 to 1945 recuperating and taking on replacement troops to fill out their numbers. A new call to action came in March 1945 when the 442nd joined the 5th Army in Italy in its attempt to break the Gothic Line. The line had withstood Allied attacks for over 5 months, so the 442nd were called upon to make a diversionary attack by basically climbing a mountain to engage the Germans. They moved so quickly that they were able to take the offensive and break the German line, starting a chain of events that ended with the surrender of German forces in Italy. It was during this action that on April 5th, 1945, Akira Toki was wounded in the head by a piece of shrapnel. So let's listen to him briefly describe that.
Did you get right through the helmet?
Yeah, mine went right through the helmet to, if you know what the helmet looks like, that little lip on the front went right there, right in the forehead. I got it. So I stayed in the hospital till the end of the war, end of Italy campaign. Then I went back to my unit.
So he mentions that again, he was shot through his helmet and wounded on the forehead. And I am always amused by articles like this. If you look at it at the bottom of the first paragraph of the newspaper article, it said Toki wrote a letter to his parents telling them that he was wounded, and he declared that his wound is not serious, which is pretty common, I think, for not only World War II soldiers, but soldiers from all conflicts. They always tell their families that it's no big deal, but he was wounded enough that he spent the rest of the Italian campaign in a hospital before he joined his unit. So it was probably a little more than he was letting on. All right, so with the war in Europe ending soon afterward, breaking the Gothic line represented the last action of the 442nd in World War II. Their record, some of which is listed on this slide, is beyond impressive. They suffered 650 dead and 9,486 wounded. Members of the unit received 21 Medals of Honor, 32 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, all in all, over 18,000 individual decorations for valor. The unit itself received 8 Presidential Unit Citations, 2 Meritorious Unit Service Plaques, 19 decorations from allied nations, and because they rescued the members of the Texas National Guard, they were named Honorary Texans. In addition to all of that, they also faced down racism and questions of their loyalty, even as many of their families were being held in internment camps. The story of Japanese Americans in World War II is a fascinating one and does deserve to be shared. As for Akira Toki, he returned to Madison and farmed his family's land into his 80s. He began volunteering at the local VA hospital when it opened in 1951 and continued volunteering there for the next 58 years, racking up over 23,000 hours of service to his fellow veterans. In 1992, Orchard Ridge Middle School in Madison changed its name to Akira Toki Middle School, and he visited the students there often. In 2009, the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs presented Toki with the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award, which you can see in this picture. Akira Toki passed away in July 2012, but because he chose to donate his papers and photographs to our museum, and because he chose to participate in our oral history interview, his story lives on through our museum. Thank you all very much. That is my story of Akira Toki and the Purple Heart Battalion, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Great, thank you, Russ, for presenting that information. We do have quite a few questions, and if you're ready to get into those, I will share, or I'll share my screen. Let's see if I can bring those questions up. The first question, Russ, did enemy units issue any particular orders on how to treat Asian Americans should they be captured? You know of?
Did any American unit issue orders on how to treat Japanese prisoners? Is that the question?
No, enemy units.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, so I think, I'm not sure if this answers the question, but you might have noticed that the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion were sent to Europe. I think there was a conscious choice by the U.S. military to not send them to the Pacific Theater at least not in large numbers, maybe for that reason. So I'm not sure if any European nations had rules about what to do if they captured Japanese American soldiers, but I don't think it was a huge issue in the Pacific theater, if that answers the question.
Sure. The second question, Russ. How was the 100th Infantry Battalion received or treated by other Army units? And I think they're trying to allude to not here in the States, but once they were actually in combat over in Europe.
Yeah, so, you know, I think you can kind of pick up a little bit of it from some of the quotes that I shared, particularly the one from Gillespie. I think there may have been some initial reluctance to accept them maybe when they arrived over in Europe, but once they showed what they were capable of doing and their bravery and their competence, I think they were accepted very quickly by U.S. troops over in Europe. It was really the people back home who weren't seeing what they were doing, who maybe were still holding on to negative thoughts.
The next question, Russ, do you know of any restrictions that were placed on Asian American soldiers during the war?
I mean, not that I've seen. We heard Toki talk about how when they were still stateside, they were definitely restricted. They weren't allowed to receive combat training. They were kept segregated while the Army kind of figured out what to do with them. But once they were overseas, I'm not aware of any restrictions that they faced.
Can you speak to maybe why Asian Americans were treated differently in the Midwest than they were on the West Coast, besides, you know, from what you mentioned about fears of spies on the West?
Yeah, I mean, this is all just kind of based on what I've read, but it really seems like perhaps a combination of the concentration of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. There were many, many, many more, combined with the fact that is the area of our country where we felt the most threatened by the Japanese. I think there was just a lot of fear of spies and sabotage and those sorts of things, versus in the Midwest. I mean, as far as I can tell, and I think from Toki's own oral history interview, they were pretty much the only Japanese American family in this area. So there wasn't a concentration. I don't think there was a fear of Japanese invading or sabotaging in this area in the Midwest. So I think that probably contributed quite a bit. In addition to just the fact that the Toki family had formed such strong ties with the residents of Madison, I think that all kind of contributed.
Did Asian American soldiers get the same separation benefits as others after the war was over?
Yeah, I've never seen anything that suggested otherwise. Like I kind of have been saying, once they got in, they were treated treated very similarly. I've not seen anything that suggests they didn't receive full benefits.
Excellent. Can you maybe speak to the ratio of those wounded during battle from this unit, the 100th Infantry Battalion, as opposed to the casualty rates of other units?
So as I was giving those statistics, I kind of anticipated a question like this, and unfortunately I am not prepared to answer that question. But if you want to follow up and send me an email, I'd be happy to put together some statistics for you. Just the fact that they earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion, I think suggests that the rate was higher than other similar units. But if you want actual numbers, I can get those for you. I just might need a little bit of time to put them together.
And then you kind of spoke to this, but maybe you can just elaborate a bit. Was U.S. policy not to send Japanese American units to fight in the Pacific theater because they were mistrusted, or were there other reasons, maybe, you know, more along the lines of, you know, their safety if they were captured or something like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the decision was made to send this large unit of Japanese Americans to Europe for a number of reasons. One, maybe to protect them a little bit. Two, to eliminate the possibility of confusion and friendly fire kind of incidents, if that makes sense. From my reading, I believe there were Japanese Americans who were sent to the Pacific Theater, but it was in much smaller numbers, and they served as, you know, translators and things like that. But yeah, I think the large groups were sent to Europe to avoid potential negative consequences for them and for other American soldiers.
Excellent. And then we got a couple questions that came through and didn't get added to the PowerPoint. But one question was, this participant's parents befriended some soldiers at Camp McCoy and stayed in touch after the war. And they're curious to know if there's a way to look into their service records if they do know their names.
It's a possibility. You know, you'd have to figure out what state they were from. It sounds like most of the 100th Battalion were from Hawaii, so I guess I'd recommend contacting the Hawaii Department of Veterans Affairs. Otherwise, there's a foundation in California. I think it's called the Go for Broke Foundation that focuses on the 442nd and the 100th Battalion. They might have some information too. So those would be my two recommendations.
And then the last question, Russ, while the audio clips did come through really well, there was that one spot where he was talking about being interrogated and strip searched and all that, and they took something away from him and they took it apart. But that particular item didn't come through very clear, and a lot of people are wondering what that item was.
Yeah, it was a pen. He said that he had a really nice fountain pen, and they took it away from him and took it apart. I would assume looking for recording devices of some sort, but yeah, he sounded a little upset that they took his pen apart, although he did say he got it back at the end.
Something so small as a pen, I guess. You know, during that time, espionage could have come in many forms. So, yeah. I don't think there's any more questions, Russ. But certainly if you could provide your contact information in case there are any more questions in future days. And just to let everybody know that this presentation will be presented on the museum's YouTube page. That should be up probably by Wednesday. So if you'd like to go back and watch the presentation again, or if you do have any questions for Russ, certainly you can get a hold of him via his email and office phone number. And I don't know if you have that slide ready, Russ.
I'm working on it here.
No problem.
Just a second.
Or maybe you could just put it in chat if that's easier.
Oh, sure. That's a good idea. Well, I got the slide right here. Just a second.
Okay.
Ah, sorry. Now you get to see another one of my presentations on genealogy. There we go.
Those are always great presentations, Russ.
So yeah, please, if anyone has any questions about this, if you have questions about anything at our museum, any Wisconsin veterans, please feel free to contact me by email or by phone. While we're still dealing with COVID, email is a much better way to get a hold of me, to be honest with you. But if phone is what works best for you, I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can.
Well, great, Russ. Thank you so much for putting this presentation together today and sharing all this information with everybody. And I would like to thank everybody for showing up this afternoon and just visiting with us and enjoying the presentation. We're always happy to have everybody come out for our events. We do have a lot of upcoming events on our virtual platform, and you can find all the information for that on our website, wisvetsmuseum.com. Just go to the events section and you'll find a complete listing of all our events. And just like this event, all our virtual events are always free. And so we highly encourage everybody to come out and join us as you have time. Russ, thank you again for a great presentation. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. It was fantastic, and we look forward to seeing you next time.